The screams echoed through the cobblestone streets of ancient Rome, a sound so haunting that even the most hardened citizens would quicken their pace and avert their eyes. These were not the cheers from the Colosseum or the bustling noise of the Forum. These were the final cries of those who had crossed the most powerful empire the world had ever known. And what awaited them was not a quick death, not a merciful end, but something far more calculated, far more deliberate, and infinitely more terrifying. When we think of Roman justice, we often picture noble senators in togas debating law in marble halls. But behind that civilized facade lay a system of punishment so brutal, so meticulously designed to inflict maximum suffering, that it would haunt the collective memory of humanity for millennia. The Romans didn't just execute their enemies. They transformed death into an art form of terror, a spectacle that would serve as both entertainment and warning to anyone who dared challenge their authority. Today, we're going to uncover 10 execution methods that were so horrific, so unimaginably cruel, that they didn't just kill the body, they destroyed the very concept of human dignity. These weren't random acts of violence or crimes of passion. These were carefully engineered systems of torture and death, perfected over centuries by the most methodical civilization in history. Each method tells us something darker about human nature, about what happens when unlimited power meets calculated cruelty. But here's what makes this even more chilling. These weren't secret practices hidden away in dungeons. They were public events, celebrated occasions where thousands would gather to watch their fellow human beings suffer in ways that would make modern horror films seem tame by comparison. The Romans turned execution into theater, death into entertainment, and suffering into a civic duty that every citizen was expected to witness and approve. Are you ready to discover why the mere mention of Roman justice could make entire nations surrender without a fight? Why prisoners would beg for slavery rather than face Roman punishment? And why these execution methods were so effective at maintaining order that they became the foundation for imperial control across 3 continents? What you're about to learn will fundamentally change how you view ancient Rome, revealing the dark machinery that powered the greatest empire in human history. Before we descend into this abyss of calculated cruelty, understand that these methods weren't born from madness or random brutality. They were the product of brilliant minds, military strategists, and legal scholars who understood something profound about human psychology. They knew that the fear of punishment could be far more powerful than punishment itself. Every crucifixion, every brutal spectacle, every public execution was carefully orchestrated to send a message that would travel across the known world. This is what happens when you challenge Rome. The first method on our list might surprise you, not because of its brutality, but because of how common it became in Roman society. It was so routine, so accepted as normal justice, that it barely registered as unusual to the average Roman citizen. Yet for us, looking back across 2 millennia, it represents one of the most systematically cruel inventions in human history: crucifixion. The very word sends chills down the spine, and for good reason. While many cultures practiced various forms of execution, the Romans elevated crucifixion to a science. This wasn't simply nailing someone to wood and waiting for them to die. It was a calculated process designed to maximize suffering while ensuring the victim remained conscious and aware for as long as possible. The condemned would first be stripped naked, robbed of their dignity, before their bodies were even touched. Then came the scourging, a preliminary torture that would leave their backs in ribbons, weakening them just enough to prolong their agony on the cross without causing immediate death. But here's what makes Roman crucifixion so particularly terrifying. They didn't just execute individuals, they executed thousands simultaneously. After the Spartacus rebellion, 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies left to rot as a warning that stretched for over 100 miles. Imagine traveling that road, seeing body after body, knowing that each one had suffered for hours or even days before finally succumbing. This wasn't just punishment, it was psychological warfare on a massive scale. The technical aspects of crucifixion reveal the cold efficiency of Roman engineering applied to human suffering. The crossbeam wasn't attached to the vertical post until the victim was already nailed to it. They would be forced to carry this patibulum through the streets, their own instrument of death weighing them down as crowds jeered and spat. Once at the execution site, the victim would be hoisted up, and here's where Roman innovation became truly diabolical. They discovered that death by crucifixion wasn't caused by blood loss or pain, but by asphyxiation. The position of the body made it nearly impossible to exhale properly, forcing the victim into a horrific cycle of pushing up on their nailed feet to breathe, then collapsing back down when the pain became unbearable. This cycle could continue for days. The Romans became so skilled at regulating this process that they could predict almost exactly how long each victim would survive based on their physical condition and the specific positioning of the cross. When they wanted to prolong suffering, they would provide a small foot support. When they wanted to speed up death, they would break the victim's legs, making it impossible to push up for air. It was execution as engineering, death as precise calculation. The second method reveals another aspect of Roman cruelty, their ability to turn the victim's own body against them. This was execution by wild beasts, known as damnatio ad bestias. But don't picture this as simply throwing someone into a pit with lions. The Romans created elaborate scenarios, theatrical productions, where the condemned would be forced to reenact mythological scenes before being torn apart by carefully selected animals. The preparation for these executions was as cruel as the event itself. Victims would be starved and weakened, then dressed in costumes that told a story the crowd would recognize. They might be forced to play Orpheus being torn apart by wild animals, or Prometheus having his liver eaten by eagles. The Romans understood that spectacle enhanced the psychological impact of execution, making it memorable, shareable, something that would be discussed in taverns and markets long after the blood had been washed from the arena sand. But the true horror of damnatio ad bestias lay in its unpredictability. Unlike crucifixion, where executions were chaos. Some victims died quickly. Death followed a predictable pattern, beast if they were lucky enough to face an efficient predator. Others would be mauled and left dying slowly as the animals lost interest. The crowd never knew exactly what they would an extra layer of terror forward witness, and this uncertainty added both spectators and future victims who knew they might face the same fate. The Romans even developed different categories of beast execution. Criminals might face lions or bears, while prisoners of war could be matched against more exotic animals brought from the far reaches of the empire. Elephants, crocodiles, even specially trained hunting dogs were employed in these spectacles. Each animal brought its own particular form of death, its own timeline of suffering, its own visual impact on the watching crowd. What made these executions particularly effective as tools of control was their public nature. They weren't hidden away in dungeons or carried out in secret. They were the main event at public games, celebrations that drew massive crowds and created a shared experience of witnessing Roman justice in action. Every person in that amphitheater went home with the same message burned into their memory. This empire had the power to command not just human life, but nature itself in service of punishment. The third method on our terrifying list demonstrates just how creative Roman minds could become when dealing with those they considered the worst offenders. This was reserved for crimes so heinous that even the Romans, with their already brutal standards, felt compelled to devise something special. It was called poenaculae, and it involved a process so bizarre, so psychologically disturbing, that modern minds struggle to comprehend how anyone could have conceived such a punishment. Picture this. The condemned would be sewn into a leather sack along with a carefully selected menagerie of animals. A dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey would be their final companions as the sack was sealed tight and thrown into the river. But this wasn't random animal selection. Each creature represented a specific symbolism in Roman culture. The dog symbolized shamelessness, the rooster represented lust, the viper embodied treachery, and the monkey signified the degradation of human nature. The victim would drown, but not before experiencing the terror of being trapped in absolute darkness with panicked, clawing, biting animals in their final moments. What makes Poena Cullae so uniquely Roman is how it combined their love of symbolism with their practical approach to execution. They weren't content with simple drowning. They needed the death to carry meaning, to tell a story that would resonate with their culture's values and fears. The condemned wasn't just dying for their crime. They were being consumed by the very vices that led them to that moment. It was execution as moral theatre, death as philosophical statement. The psychological impact on witnesses was devastating. Unlike the spectacle of the arena, Poena Cullae created a different kind of horror. The crowd couldn't see what was happening inside that leather prison, but they could imagine it. They could hear the muffled sounds, see the sack writhing in the water, and their minds would fill in the terrifying details. Sometimes the most effective terror comes not from what you see, but from what you're forced to imagine. Our fourth method reveals the Romans' understanding of how social humiliation could be as devastating as physical pain. This was execution by exposure, but with a uniquely Roman twist that transformed it from simple abandonment into systematic psychological destruction. The condemned would be stripped naked and bound in the most public location possible, usually the forum or other heavily trafficked areas, and left to die slowly from hunger, thirst, and exposure, while the entire city witnessed their degradation. But here's what made this particularly cruel. The Romans made it interactive. Citizens were encouraged to mock, spit upon, and torment the dying person. Children would throw stones, merchants would use them as cautionary tales for their customers, and philosophers would point to them as examples in their lectures about virtue and vice. The victim became a living prop in the daily life of the city, their suffering woven into the routine activities of thousands of people. The brilliance of this method lay in its efficiency. It required no special equipment, no exotic animals, no elaborate construction. It simply turned the entire urban population into willing participants in the execution process. Every person who walked past and chose not to help became complicit in the death. Every citizen who brought their children to see became an educator in Roman justice. The execution became a community event that reinforced social bonds while simultaneously terrorizing potential criminals. This method also served as a powerful deterrent because it removed any possibility of dying with dignity or honor. In a culture that valued reputation and social standing above almost everything else, the prospect of dying naked and humiliated in front of the entire community was often more terrifying than death itself. Many condemned prisoners would beg for crucifixion instead, seeing it as a more honorable way to die. The fifth method on our list showcases Roman engineering applied to the art of execution in ways that would make modern torture devices seem primitive by comparison. This was the furca, a device that transformed the simple act of carrying a burden into an instrument of prolonged death. The condemned would be forced to carry a heavy wooden fork-shaped yoke across their shoulders, with their arms bound to the crossbar. But this wasn't just about the weight. The genius of the furca lay in its gradual escalation of suffering. Initially, the burden might seem manageable, even trivial compared to other Roman punishments. But as hours turned to days, the constant pressure on the shoulders and neck would begin to cause excruciating pain. The weight would cut off circulation, cause muscles to cramp and spasm, and eventually lead to complete physical breakdown. The victim would be conscious throughout most of this process, fully aware of their deteriorating condition, but powerless to stop it. What made the furka particularly insidious was its public nature. The condemned would be paraded through the streets, forced to announce their crimes to anyone who would listen. They became walking advertisements for Roman justice, living examples of what happened to those who challenged imperial authority. Citizens would gather to watch these processions, sometimes following the condemned for hours to witness their gradual deterioration. The psychological torture was as carefully calibrated as the physical punishment. The condemned knew that their suffering was entertainment for others, that their pain was being consumed as spectacle. They could see the faces of the crowd, read the mixture of fascination and disgust in their expressions, and understand that they had been reduced from human beings to objects of curiosity. This awareness of their own dehumanization often broke their spirits long before their bodies gave out. Roman authorities understood that the furka's effectiveness came not just from the physical punishment, but from the way it transformed the condemned into walking symbols of imperial power. Every step they took while carrying that burden was a demonstration of Rome's ability to control not just life and death, but the very manner in which both were experienced. It was domination made visible, authority given physical form. The sixth method reveals perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of Roman execution: their ability to turn hope itself into an instrument of torture. This was the practice of clemency revocation, where condemned prisoners would be offered apparent mercy, only to have it brutally withdrawn at the last possible moment. The victim would be prepared for execution, brought to the very edge of death, and then dramatically saved by imperial intervention. But this salvation was an illusion. The reprieve would last just long enough for hope to take root, for the condemned to begin imagining a future beyond their punishment. They might be fed better food, given clean clothes, even allowed to send messages to their families. This period of false hope could last weeks or even months, during which the victim would experience genuine relief and gratitude toward their captors. Then, without warning, the execution would resume. But now the condemned faced death, not as someone who had accepted their fate, but as someone whose hope had been carefully cultivated and then destroyed. The psychological impact was devastating. They died not just from their physical punishment, but from the complete collapse of their mental defenses. The Romans had weaponized hope itself, turning one of humanity's most essential emotions into a tool of torment. This method was particularly effective because it created witnesses who could spread stories of Roman unpredictability. Families and friends who had celebrated the apparent mercy would be left to grapple with its sudden revocation. These secondary victims would carry the trauma of false hope for the rest of their lives, serving as living reminders of imperial capriciousness to everyone they encountered. The seventh method demonstrates how the Romans could transform even the most basic human needs into instruments of terror. This was execution by forced consumption, where the condemned would be compelled to ingest substances that would kill them slowly and painfully from the inside. But this wasn't simple poisoning. The Romans had perfected techniques that would cause maximum internal suffering, while keeping the victim conscious and aware throughout their deterioration. Molten lead was poured down the throats of those convicted of treason, the liquid metal burning through their digestive system, while they remained awake to experience every moment of their organs being destroyed from within. Others were forced to drink massive quantities of wine mixed with ground glass, creating internal lacerations that would cause slow bleeding and agonizing death over several days. The most sadistic variant involved forcing victims to consume their own severed body parts, usually fingers or toes that had been removed as part of the preliminary torture. What made this method particularly horrifying was how it perverted the basic act of nourishment. Food and drink, the most fundamental requirements for life, became the very mechanism of death. The condemned would feel their body's natural hunger and thirst, but satisfying these needs would only accelerate their demise. It was a cruel inversion of survival instincts, where the victim's own biology worked against them in the most intimate possible way. The public aspect of forced consumption added another layer of psychological torment. Crowds would gather to watch the condemned struggle with their deadly meals, cheering when they vomited blood or collapsed from internal injuries. The spectacle became a twisted feast where the audience consumed entertainment while the victim consumed death. Roman citizens would bring their own food to these events, eating and drinking normally while watching others die from the very acts they were performing. The eighth method reveals the Romans' mastery of using time itself as a weapon of execution. This was death by gradual dismemberment, where the condemned would have their limbs removed one joint at a time over a period of days or even weeks. But the true genius of this method wasn't in the cutting. It was in the precise medical attention given to keep the victim alive throughout the entire process. Roman military doctors, skilled in battlefield surgery, would be present to cauterize wounds and prevent fatal blood loss. Each amputation was performed with surgical precision, ensuring that the victim would survive to experience the next stage of their dismemberment. They would start with fingers and toes, moving gradually to hands and feet, then forearms and lower legs, creating a systematic reduction of the human body while maintaining consciousness and awareness. The psychological impact was calculated to break the victim's mind long before their body gave out. They would be forced to watch their own gradual disappearance, to see themselves becoming less human with each cut. The Romans understood that identity is closely tied to physical wholeness, and by systematically removing pieces of the body, they were destroying the person's sense of self as much as their physical form. Witnesses to these executions would often become ill or faint, not from the gore itself, but from the methodical nature of the process. There was something uniquely disturbing about watching a human being systematically reduced to nothing, piece by carefully removed piece. The Romans had turned amputation into a form of slow-motion murder that attacked both body and psyche simultaneously. The ninth method showcases Roman creativity in combining multiple forms of torture into a single, devastating execution process. This was known as the wheel, but the Roman version was far more sophisticated than the simple breaking wheels used by other cultures. The condemned would be bound to a large wooden wheel, but instead of simply being beaten to death, they would be subjected to a carefully orchestrated sequence of punishments that could last for days. The wheel would be slowly rotated while various implements were applied to different parts of the victim's body. Hot irons would burn their flesh as they passed certain points in the rotation. Sharp spikes would pierce their skin at calculated intervals. Wild animals would be allowed to bite and claw at them during specific portions of the wheel's revolution. The entire apparatus was designed to create a never-ending cycle of different types of pain, ensuring that no part of the body would become numb or accustomed to any single form of torment. What made the Roman wheel particularly diabolical was its predictability. The victim would learn the pattern of their suffering, knowing exactly when the next burn would come, when the next spike would pierce their flesh, when the next animal would attack. This anticipation became its own form of torture, as they would mentally experience each upcoming agony before it actually occurred. The wheel created a hellish routine where suffering became as regular and expected as the rising and setting of the sun. The crowds who gathered to watch wheel executions would often stay for hours or even days, making bets on how long the condemned would survive or which part of the cycle would finally kill them. Food vendors would set up nearby, turning the prolonged execution into a festival atmosphere where death became entertainment and suffering became spectacle. The Romans had transformed execution into a form of theatre that could run for multiple acts, with intermissions for the audience to refresh themselves while the victim continued their endless cycle of torment. The 10th and final method on our horrifying list represents perhaps the ultimate expression of Roman ingenuity applied to human suffering. This was execution by living burial. but with modifications that made simple interment seem merciful by comparison. The condemned would be placed in a specially constructed underground chamber with just enough air to survive, but not enough to remain comfortable. They would be given minimal food and water, calculated to keep them alive for as long as possible, while their sanity slowly deteriorated in complete darkness and isolation. But here's where Roman engineering made this punishment truly nightmarish. The burial chamber would be designed with acoustic properties that amplified every sound the victim made. Their screams, their sobs, their desperate pleas for mercy would echo and reverberate through carefully constructed sound channels that led to the surface. Citizens walking above could hear the underground torment, creating an invisible but constant reminder of what lay beneath their feet. Some chambers were equipped with viewing tubes that allowed visitors to look down and observe the condemned in their final stages of madness and decay. Others had speaking tubes that permitted limited communication, allowing the buried victim to beg for mercy or confess additional crimes to anyone willing to listen. The Romans had created a form of living hell that existed parallel to normal city life, where the damned could be heard but not saved, observed but not rescued. The psychological impact on the condemned was complete and total destruction of their humanity. Deprived of light, human contact, and hope, they would often lose their minds long before their bodies failed. They would talk to imaginary companions, relive memories that became increasingly distorted, and eventually descend into a madness so complete that death came as a mercy they no longer had the sanity to appreciate. What made living burial so effective as a tool of imperial control was its invisible nature. Unlike the spectacle of the arena or the public display of crucifixion, this punishment created fear through absence rather than presence. Citizens knew that somewhere beneath their feet, people were dying in unimaginable conditions. The very ground they walked on became suspect, potentially hiding chambers of torment that could swallow them if they ever crossed imperial authority. These 10 methods represent more than just historical curiosities or examples of ancient brutality. They reveal a systematic approach to human destruction that was calculated, refined, and perfected over centuries. The Romans didn't just kill their enemies, they created technologies of terror that would haunt human consciousness for millennia, establishing precedents for cruelty that would echo through history long after the empire itself had fallen. Each execution was a masterclass in psychological warfare, designed not just to eliminate individual threats, but to create lasting fear in entire populations. The Romans understood that the death of one person, properly orchestrated, could control the behavior of millions. They had weaponized suffering itself, turning execution into a form of mass communication that spoke directly to humanity's deepest fears and most primal anxieties. But perhaps what's most chilling about these execution methods isn't their individual brutality, but what they reveal about the infrastructure of terror that supported them. Behind every crucifixion stood an entire industry of specialized craftsmen, carpenters who perfected the angles of crossbeams to maximize suffering, blacksmiths who forged nails with specific lengths and thicknesses to ensure proper placement through flesh and bone, medical professionals who calculated exactly how much blood loss a victim could sustain before unconsciousness would rob the spectacle of its impact. The Romans had created what we might call today a military-industrial complex of human suffering. Entire workshops were dedicated to manufacturing the tools of execution. Families passed down generational knowledge about the most effective techniques for prolonging agony. Young apprentices learned their trades by watching master executioners demonstrate the subtle arts of timing, positioning, and crowd management that transformed simple killing into psychological warfare. Consider the logistics required for mass executions like those following the Spartacus rebellion. 6,000 crosses didn't appear overnight along the Appian Way. This required months of planning, coordination between multiple military units, procurement of massive quantities of wood and iron, and the deployment of thousands of soldiers and craftsmen. It was a project that demanded the same organizational capabilities that built aqueducts and conquered nations, except its purpose was purely to terrorize. The economic impact was staggering. Entire industries emerged to support the execution apparatus. Slave traders specialized in providing victims for the arena. Animal trainers developed techniques for making beasts more aggressive and unpredictable. Architects designed amphitheaters with hidden chambers and mechanical devices that could lift wild animals into the arena or flood the entire space for naval battle reenactments, where condemned prisoners would die by drowning or dismemberment. Even the waste management of mass execution became a specialized field. Teams of workers were trained in the rapid disposal of bodies, the cleaning of blood from arena sand, and the maintenance of execution equipment. The smell of death became so common in certain districts of Rome that property values would fluctuate based on proximity to execution sites. Citizens would plan their daily routes to avoid areas where the stench of rotting corpses might overpower their senses. The psychological conditioning required to maintain this system reveals another disturbing aspect of Roman society. Children grew up attending public executions as naturally as they might attend religious festivals or market days. The screams of the dying became background noise in their developing minds. Young Romans learned to associate entertainment with human suffering, celebration with death, and civic duty with witnessing cruelty. This normalization of extreme violence created a population that could commit atrocities without experiencing the moral conflicts that might trouble other societies. Roman soldiers could crucify entire villages without psychological trauma because they had been conditioned from childhood to view such actions as normal expressions of imperial authority. The execution methods weren't just tools of punishment. They were instruments of social programming that shaped the collective conscience of an entire civilization. The religious dimension of Roman executions adds yet another layer of horror to these practices. Many execution methods were designed to prevent the condemned from achieving what Romans considered a proper death. In Roman belief, the manner of one's death directly affected their status in the afterlife. By ensuring that victims died in degraded, humiliated conditions, the Romans believed they were condemning their enemies not just in this world, but for eternity. Crucifixion was particularly effective in this regard because it prevented the traditional Roman practices of cremation and proper burial. Bodies left to rot on crosses were denied the ritual purification that Romans believed was necessary for peaceful rest in death. The condemned would die knowing that their suffering would continue beyond their physical demise, that they were being erased not just from life, but from any hope of dignified existence in whatever came after. The arena executions were often timed to coincide with religious festivals, transforming the deaths into offerings to the gods. The spilled blood of condemned criminals was believed to please deities associated with war and justice. Priests would sometimes collect this blood for use in purification rituals, turning the victims into unwilling participants in the very religious ceremonies that celebrated their destruction. Some execution methods were specifically designed to mock the religious beliefs of Rome's enemies. Christians might be forced to reenact scenes from their own scriptures before being torn apart by beasts. Jewish prisoners could be crucified in positions that parodied their religious practices. Germanic warriors might be sacrificed using perverted versions of their own ritual customs. The Romans weaponized spirituality itself, turning faith into another avenue for humiliation and terror. The bureaucracy of death in ancient Rome was as complex and efficient as any modern government agency. Detailed records were kept of every execution, including the specific crimes, the methods employed, and the duration of suffering. These documents served multiple purposes. They provided data for improving future executions, created legal precedents for similar cases, and established a paper trail that could be referenced when dealing with family members or associates of the condemned. Special courts were established solely to determine the most appropriate execution method for different categories of crime. Judges would consider factors like the victim's social status, the nature of their offense, and the desired psychological impact on various audiences. And noblemen who committed treason might receive a different treatment than a slave who murdered his master, not because the crimes were different in severity, but because each required a different type of deterrent message. These 10 methods of execution reveal the terrifying truth about Rome's dominance. Their greatest weapon wasn't the gladius or the legion, but the systematic transformation of death into a tool of absolute control. They understood that true power comes not from the ability to kill, but from the ability to make people afraid of how they might die. The empire that gave us roads, aqueducts, and law also perfected the art of human suffering to a degree that still haunts our collective memory today. The next time you see a Roman statue or read about their military conquests, remember what lay beneath that marble grandeur, a machinery of terror so efficient that its echoes still whisper through the darkest corners of human history.